The request which arises from the human heart in the supreme confrontation with suffering and death, especially when faced with the temptation to give up in utter desperation, is above all a request for companionship, sympathy and support in the time of trial. It is a plea for help to keep on hoping when all human hopes fail.
So I think it's very important to be clear about what is and what isn't euthanasia, because there's a lot of confusion about this. Bishop Anthony Fisher put it this way a couple of years ago. He said euthanasia is an act or a calculated course of omission intended to shorten the patient's life with a supposedly merciful motivation. So what's critical is the intention, the doctor's intention to shorten the patient's life. Now this means that a whole range of practices that people mistake for euthanasia aren't euthanasia at all. For instance, if a doctor withdraws a burdensome treatment, a treatment that's just too burdensome for the patient at the patient's request, or if the patient isn't able to have that conversation at the request, say, of the family, that's not euthanasia. It's good medical practice and it should happen more often than it does. Or again, if a doctor finds that the only way he can relieve a patient's suffering is by sedating the patient lightly, that's not euthanasia either, although it will mean that the patient won't live as long as he otherwise would have. That's good medical practice, and again, that should happen more often than it does. So again, what's critical is the intention to shorten the patient's life. And the other thing that's important to notice is that the supposedly merciful motivation for the patient's sake is what distinguishes this form of killing from other forms of killing. Now, you can do euthanasia by overdosing the patient, by giving the patient a lethal injection, even by pulling a bag over the patient's head. But let's say use the example of giving a lethal injection. You can give a lethal injection to someone who's terminally ill, and you can give a lethal injection to someone who's not terminally ill at all. You can give a lethal injection to a newborn baby, who certainly can't ask for it. You can give a lethal injection to a very old person who's begun to lose their cognitive faculties, who certainly can't ask for it. So you can give a lethal injection to people who are in fact perfectly well. And what this means in the lingo is that euthanasia can be voluntary, it can be non-voluntary, it can even be involuntary, which means against what the patient wants. So there are lots of different forms of euthanasia, but the critical thing to understand is that what distinguishes euthanasia is the intention to shorten the patient's life with a supposedly merciful motivation. So some people think that there's really no problem with euthanasia so long as it's limited to the voluntary. Well, I think the first thing to note is that there's no right to be killed by someone else. Common morality doesn't contain such a right. The common law tradition doesn't contain such a right. There's no right to be killed in declarations of human rights. No medical code contains the right for the patient to be killed, no nursing code. But here I think is the central point to make. Almost no doctor who provides euthanasia is prepared to provide it for anyone who walks in off the street. What the doctor normally does is ask questions of the person who wants euthanasia to find out why that person wants it. Is it because of illness? Is it because of pain? Is it because of loneliness? Is it because they feel a burden on others? So what the doctor's trying to decide is whether he's going to provide it or not. So the decision really falls to the doctor. So if the decision really falls to the doctor, then there's absolutely no reason why he shouldn't provide euthanasia to someone who he thinks would be better off dead, but who hasn't asked for it. So I think that the line between the voluntary and the non-voluntary simply cannot be held.
True compassion leads to sharing another's pain. It does not kill the person whose suffering we cannot bear.
Certainly we have a very deep obligation to relieve people's suffering. Pain associated with terminal illness should be relieved, and mostly it can be. The difficulty is that sometimes doctors aren't as well trained as they might be. Sometimes vets are better at relieving pain in animals than are doctors at relieving pain in human beings, and that's just a terrible disgrace. And then sometimes, even if the doctor does have the skill and judgment involved, his services may not be accessible to all Australians. So we have some very big challenges in ensuring that people don't die in pain and other forms of discomfort. Another form of suffering that people experience is kind of psychological suffering. They may be lonely, they may be deeply anxious, they may be isolated, they may be depressed. Now, all of those provide their own challenges to us, their caregivers. And sometimes I think when we talk about putting people out of their misery, what we really mean is putting ourselves out of our misery, because we find it so hard to walk with people who are lonely and anxious and depressed and isolated. But there's the challenge for us, and it calls up what is most noble in human beings, to live up to that challenge of saying to someone who feels like that about themselves, no, you are somebody. You really matter to us. You matter to us all the way through to your death. And we will respect your dignity as a human being as we try to ensure that you die as well as you can. So that's, I think, what compassion calls from us, not killing people.
Euthanasia is a false solution to the drama of suffering, a solution unworthy of man. Indeed, the true response cannot be to put someone to death, however kindly, but rather to witness to the love that helps people to face their pain and agony in a human way. We can be certain that no tear, neither of those who are suffering nor of those who are close to them, is lost before God. If it is true that human life is in the hands of God, it is no less true that these are loving hands, like those of a mother who accepts, nurtures and takes care of her child. I have calmed and quieted my soul like a child quieted at its mother's breast. Like a child that is quieted is my soul.